So good afternoon. I'm Dr. Debotri Dhar, and I'd like to welcome everyone to Engaged Pedagogy, an interdisciplinary panel at the University of Michigan on undergraduate teaching. And just in case you missed it, I'm also wearing our logo. We are here today to celebrate the lifetime contributions and achievements of Dr. P. Nick Kardulias, Professor of Classical Civilizations, Anthropology, and Chair Archaeology at the College of Wooster, Ohio, who has just retired after 30 years of work, 1980 to 2020, indeed a life in educating. He earned his PhD from Ohio State and taught there and at Kenyon before joining Wooster, the author of a monograph and the editor or co-editor of numerous scholarly volumes, combined with decades of fieldwork in Greece and Cyprus. He is also the recipient of a national award for undergraduate teaching. Thank you so much, Nick, for making time for us today. This event is a collaboration between my work in Women's and Gender Studies, my upper seminar 330, with whose students I wanted very much to share these dialogues, and the University of Michigan's Museum of Anthropological Archaeology, whose director, Dr. Michael Galaty, agreed to offer the closing comments today, and also very kindly made his unit staff available for further support, including tech support. Thank you so much, Mike. While the event is open to all University of Michigan faculty, staff, and students, I am delighted that some folks from other institutions are also joining in by invitation, both as speakers and as audience, and in certain instances from other time zones. I'm deeply thankful to Dr. Michael Toumazou from Davidson College, Dr. Greg Wiles from Wooster, and Dr. Whitney Goodwin from the University of Missouri. Many thanks to John for designing the eye-catching flyer, to Amy for coordinating these technological aspects, and to our WGS Chief Administrator, Kevin O'Neill, for magically making other logistics possible. So Kevin isn't here today, but he's the guy in our department who, smoothly and very efficiently makes things work. Thanks to all the students attending today as well. I may have prizes for you at the end for questions, so do stay on. So, as some of us might know, Black feminist scholar and educator Bell Hooks speaks of engaged pedagogy as a set of scholarly, creative, and even spiritual teaching and learning practices focused on well-being, self-actualization for both professors and their students, and education as a continuous and affirming source of growth and joy. Critiquing a rote, memorizing, assembly line approach to learning, that's exactly what she calls it. She instead frames knowledge as a field in which we all collectively labor, with our own unique journeys and experiences as individuals. Ultimately, she emphasizes the role of educators as healers, not just in shaping careers, but in shaping lives. To the extent that the perspectives of people of color otherwise tend to circulate mostly within our own communities, I so wanted to use engaged pedagogy, therefore, as an expansive and overarching framework for today's discussion. Nick, you and I were colleagues for a brief year. I remember how we met. I was struggling with a giant scanning machine that was entirely impervious to my pleas until you stepped in to help. That was my first job after earning my PhD. And during that time, and in the years that have followed, you have been a teacher, a mentor, and a friend, listening as I've shared my challenges, celebrating my small successes, and encouraging me always to push myself and to challenge boundaries. While most of your colleagues know you in terms of your accomplishments within academia, I have felt so personally inspired to know about the long and difficult journey you had to take to get there. As the son of immigrants who barely spoke English, as a first-generation high school and college student from a blue-collar background whose father labored in construction. I have learned so much from your dedication to your work, and above all, the love you have for your students, from encouraging them to enjoy their work, to taking them on field trips, motivating them to do research and to publish early on, to even organizing barbecues at your home where you've cooked for them. I like cooking for my students too, and I must say Nick is one of the people I've taken inspiration from. And so while you are more used to presenting on scholarly aspects of your work, I wanted for you to talk about your journey today, and above all, your pedagogy, and to be able to share that with my students. So before I invite you to do that, Dr. Michael Toumazou, your longtime colleague from Davidson, would be sharing a few words. There's a time difference, so Dr. Toumazou had to leave early. I wanted to see if he is here. Mike, are you here? Were you able to join in, Mike? Because I sent the Zoom link, etc. again later, so there may have been troubles with him joining in. So if he's able to join in later, we'll call on him. So then we'll move on to you, Nick, and have you share your journey with us. Thank you so much again for doing this for us today.
Well, first of all, I want to thank Debotri and Mike Galaty, for helping to organize this today. And what I want to do is give you kind of an overview of kinds of things that I've worked with, the people I've worked with over a number of years. And let me get this going here. So what I guess I'd like to start with is just a basic understanding that the word pedagogy, coming from the Greek, which means the education or the training of youth, is something that I find is an encompassing endeavor, just as Debotri was suggesting. Our life experiences enrich our teaching, I think. I've brought into the classroom my background as a working class kid whose immigrant parents did not complete even junior high school, but emphasized education nonetheless. They also emphasize the importance of family, and even those that you never met. As an anthropologist, the role of kinship and tracing roots has been both an academic and a personal interest. And we get at some of the basic kinds of questions that anthropologists, and I think many other students of the human condition ask. What does it mean to be human? What links us? How are these different ties forged over time? Working in a steel mill several summers as a college student helped me, for example, to more fully appreciate my father's almost 40 years in that industrial environment. And I also brought that basic kind of knowledge to the process of understanding things, in the classroom. In other words, when I talked about metallurgy and technology, I tried to convey, my own personal experiences about that, to the students. My mother's experiences included surviving the loss of her father as an infant. And she survived that because of the strong network of maternal kin that she had. So as an anthropologist, again, kinship becomes a critically important aspect of who and what we are. She also had the experience of living through the horrors of the fascist occupation of Greece in World War II. And it's difficult in some ways, I think, even for myself, but certainly for a lot of others, to really think about the difficulties that our ancestors, our immediate parents and grandparents lived through in many different ways, especially, for myself. I think about, growing up in the 1950s and 1960s in the United States, the post-war prosperity was really quite different from what my parents had experienced. It was important for me to come to an understanding of that and then to try to communicate that over time to my students and to many others. I learned from my parents the value of oral tradition for creating the base, the foundation of a social fabric. And it was a lesson in some ways in adversity, but also one, a lesson in taking joy in the things that we can take a joy in. So I tend to think of, any kind of an academic career as kind of a meander, switching back and forth over time. And this particular idea here, I think, is critically important. You've got to know who you are so that you can then communicate a variety of other kinds of things, to the people around you, including your colleagues and your students. My particular story, in many ways, begins in Greece in a small island of Kalymnos. And this is where my parents are from. The island is noted for sponge fishermen, and there's part of the take. And as you can see, a very crowded, small urban conditions there. And also just even in understanding, the people that we're descended from. For example, I knew my parents as adults, but here they are as young people on the left. And also just kind of keeping tabs on the historical documents that have become critically important in defining, who we are. For example, there's my father's draft registration card from World War II. So it's important to know the people, who are close to you, but it's also important to know those individuals to whom you're related, who you may never have met. For example, in the top row is my paternal grandfather and my maternal grandmother. Never met them. They died before I was born. And yet, they, in some ways, help to define, who and what we are. The bottom row on the left is my father's brother, oldest brother, Apostolos. And on the right, the man with the mustache in the military uniform is my mother's brother. Both of them died during the Second World War. And again, I never met them. However, I was named after both of them, Apostolos Nicholas. And so what I find really interesting and important is that when the Greeks name an individual after one of their ancestors, they literally use the term that you have been resurrected through them. So it's this notion of continuity that is, I think, critically important. And it's, I think, a vital aspect of, who and what we are in various ways. And for me, then, growing up in steel towns in Western Pennsylvania and Eastern Ohio, that also is kind of a defining characteristic for myself, both as a person, but also as an educator. And that then I try to transmit in many ways, to the people that I've come to know through classroom studies. And of course, we have our familial connections, but also the whole collection of friends, that come to form in many ways our personalities and help us then to become stronger individuals, and as a result, stronger teachers, I think. From a formal standpoint, my university education began at Youngstown State University in Eastern Ohio. And I had a series of very important mentors there. On the lower left, the tall fella on the far left of that photograph is Ray Fry. This is our field school in 1974, my first archaeological field experience. In the upper right is John White, one of the key individuals, who was a dynamic teacher, a great field researcher, and also someone that I was able to collaborate with in a variety of different ways. In the lower right is another colleague, this is cultural anthropologist Mark Schutz, who was one of the people from whom I learned a great deal in terms of understanding theory. One of the people who could really delve into theory and make it actually understandable to me. And then as a result, that helped me to find ways to help students comprehend the importance of theory. So the first archaeological experiences I had was at this particular site in Western Pennsylvania, and there's our martlet crew. You can see very much in the 1970s mode of apparel. And one of the things that Gary did is he gave me the assignment, novice that I was, of mapping the site. So, learning the basic techniques of how that is done is really important. And that's something that I carried into my own classroom work in a method and theory class that I've taught at the university, at the college here for many years. And also when I was at Kenyon, I have students go out and do mapping of a portion of the campus, because by actually doing the field work, they get a better comprehension of what it means to do that kind of element of the work. I also learned how to both appreciate and study stone tools in particular from the work that Gary had conducted. I worked there for 1 season. He worked there a total of 4 seasons on that excavation. So I really began my studies of lithics, at this particular site through that material. Once Gary retired from Youngstown State, I brought all of that material to the College of Wooster and had my students study the same basic materials that I had helped to excavate. And as a result, several of them were able to do their senior thesis based on that work. One in 2010 here, and another one of the students in 2014. So there's a continuity in terms of the development of the research aspects. John was primarily a prehistorian, but when he came to Youngstown, one of the things that he took up was historical archaeology. And that's what got me interested in that component of it as well. He studied, first of all, the blast furnace part of Ohio. This is an area well known for its steel production. So the study of these early blast furnaces dating to the early part of the 19th century was critical for kind of looking at the historical development of a key part of the economy in this part of the world. He also studied this particular building here, which is a mill in Youngstown, and helped in the renovation of it. So it became part of a public display that people could visit and come to understand sort of the historical background of their region. John was to say the least, a colorful individual, both in terms of his classroom work. He was an outstanding classroom instructor, but also in the field, one of the best field archaeologists I've ever met. One of the things that I learned from John was to be thorough in your work, but also that you can conduct excavations even on weekends. So often, both when I was at Kenyon and also here at Wooster, providing students an opportunity to get into the field, even if it's on a Saturday, and sometimes the weather cooperates and sometimes it doesn't. One of the other things that John did was to be more than generous in sharing the research opportunities. So my first 2 peer-reviewed articles were co-authored with John. And that was, a model, again, that I've taken to heart with my own students. My first real deep experiences working in Greece began in the early 1980s, and there worked in the Southern Argolid. One of the people I worked with was Curtis Runnels, who is an expert in stone tool production and analysis. And I studied with him for 3 years, during that project, and learned a tremendous amount about how to do that kind of analysis, and also learn also about the various ways that one can communicate that kind of information, to people who are not necessarily expert. Priscilla Murray, who was also part of that particular project, she was able to lead me into another segment of archaeology, and that is ethnoarchaeology, where one studies basically contemporary kinds of settings to see what you can glean from that and see how that might reflect and help you develop ideas about the past. Priscilla and I worked with a modern potter, and then we also looked at some of the agro-pastoral settings in this particular region. And I took that information and that approach, to some of the studies that I've done in Cyprus. Here, we were doing an analysis of the modern water system and how the water is distributed in this particular village. Critically important, obviously, resource, especially in this area of Cyprus, which is one of the driest on the whole island. We also became very interested in looking at how people try to maintain some of the traditional crafts. This is an individual whose father had worked in the stone mines nearby for many years. And even though he's working more with modern kinds of equipment, for example, manufacturing the stone plaques that you see in our lower right for modern houses, he also continues to make some of the traditional water troughs, which were not necessarily necessary now, but he wants to sort of maintain those old traditions in many ways. My colleague Rick Yerkes, who worked with me in Cyprus for a number of years, also another lithic expert, he and I were able to collaborate both in terms of conducting an archaeological survey, but also then specifically looking at a particular type of stone tool and the way that it has kind of survived, from antiquity all the way up into the 20th century. These are implements that you see here are what are called threshing sledges. It's a critically important component of the agricultural activity of processing the crops after they've been harvested. And we did basic analysis, and then Rick was an expert of looking at these particular kinds of tools through microscope and being able then to identify very specific kinds of signatures. So he taught me that particular approach, and I've again tried to utilize some of that information and communicate that to my students. I had a little bit more experience with this in a particular summer, which was really quite fascinating, going to the former USSR, what is now today the separate country of Moldova, where we're doing a laboratory working with a number of Soviet scholars and a few Americans, doing the analysis of different stone tools using microscopes. This particular technique had been pioneered by the Russians. And then in the upper left there, you see the tall fellow with the beard, not Lenin, but the guy who's right next to him, is Larry Keeley, who pioneered a specific approach using these kinds of microscopes. And he came and lectured to the Russians and to the American contingent, of which I was one. It was also an opportunity to kind of see a country in ferment. This was a time basically when the Soviet Union was collapsing. And to be able to see some of that firsthand, to see perestroika and the other elements really coming together was a really eye-opening experience. This is a protest in the city of Odessa down on the Black Sea. And that's really been important for me because one of the classes I teach, in addition to archaeology classes, is political anthropology. And understanding political structures in a variety of different places is a really important element. And I think something that opens our eyes, to what's developing outside of our own country. In Greece, I've worked extensively with a variety of different people at the site of Isthmia, as you see pointed out by the arrow there. Isthmia was a very important ancient site going all the way back to considerable antiquity, to say roughly the 8th century BC. It was a major sanctuary of Poseidon. And the director of the portion of the project that I worked with is Tim Gregory from Ohio State. So when I went there as a graduate student in the mid-1980s, I worked very closely with Tim. He was in the history department. I was an anthropology student, but he was more than willing to kind of cross-disciplinary boundaries. And I found that, very important for my development as a scholar, but also as a way of understanding, that we shouldn't be limited in terms of our understanding of present or past by, very kind of stringent boundaries. And working with Tim, we did various kinds of analyses. You can see this fortification system that's on the right-hand side in that diagram, and that became the basis for my dissertation. Tim was very gracious, and again, in allowing me to utilize a lot of the data from that investigation for my dissertation. We also had an issue there with a particular building from the Roman period, about the 2nd century AD, a very elaborate Roman bath with this very intricate mosaic floor, which had suffered some significant damage in antiquity. And that required a very concerted effort of conservation. So we learned about, how not only to excavate things, but also to conserve these kinds of remains. And it's a long, detailed process. And then the reconstruction of the remains until, it is in its now much better present condition. I also began work when I was at Kenyon College, working in North American archaeology. So while I had sort of one foot in the Mediterranean, I also maintained one foot in North American archaeology. And one of the things that I'd learned from a number of people, from Tim, from John White, Gary Fry, and others, was that maintaining good contacts with the local community was critically important for us as scholars, but also to kind of let the people know precisely what we're doing. On the left there is Jim Acton. He was the owner of a particular property. He had found some materials on his land. He called me up when I was at Kenyon my first year. He said, please come and take a look at this material. Tell me what it is. He had found basically a prehistoric archaeological site on his property. And I asked him if we could go and excavate. He said, you'd be more than welcome to do that. So starting in the fall of 1991, basically every weekend when the weather was good, in the fall and in the spring for about 6 years, we conducted an excavation on his property. And it was a great way for a number of the students that I had to come into the field and learn the field techniques. So we studied the way that these things are done in the classroom, but then the field becomes sort of an extension of the classroom. It becomes a laboratory, if you will. And a number of the students then, went on to professional careers afterwards. The fellow on the left in the gray sweatshirt is now teaching at a community college in anthropology in California. The woman sitting there taking notes worked with me subsequently in Cyprus on stone tools also. The fellow in the upper right, the tall guy, became an archaeologist in his own right also, and has conducted a series of excavations, major excavations in various parts of Greece. One of the things we also wanted to do was to sort of open it up. The two people in the upper right hand next to Joe were high school teachers. They wanted to come and spend a weekend with us to basically learn the techniques. And then we also opened it up, to young students, from the local elementary school to come and learn something about the local archaeology in this particular part of Central Ohio. And in some cases, the kids really got into getting down in the dirt and digging. And the excitement, I think, of hands-on learning is something that stays with you, once you're able to do it, as a youngster. One of the things also that I'd learned from my colleagues was that you should try to help your students, kind of follow all the way through. So this particular article was co-authored with these 4 undergraduate students, and it was published in a professional journal. The other place where I've worked extensively is the island of Cyprus. The red rectangle there sort of denotes our project area. And here's my colleague, Mike Toumazou. We've worked together now for 30 years in this particular project. And one of the things that we've done is for many, many years, we've had an archaeological field school. So again, students take classes, they learn the basic historical periods, they learn the culture, then they come into the field and we teach them about how you actually gather the data in the field and then go through that process of interpreting it. So instruction is practical in the sense, that they're actually excavating or doing survey work, but they're also getting lectures, from us. The part of the project that I was responsible for was actually walking through the countryside with groups of students. Here we have students from Kenya and from Ohio State, and locating a variety of different kinds of materials. The materials in the upper left are stone tools that date back some 6,000 to 7,000 years. But the main part of the excavation that Michael was directly, responsible for, for many years, retrieved a wide range of different kinds of materials, lots and lots of pottery, but also statues. We excavated tombs and a variety of other kinds of things. And then you build a team. This is Rick Yerkes and myself with a group of our students from Kenya and from Ohio State in 1992. Mike, you might recognize the third guy from the right is your good friend, Bill Parkinson. And next to him is Jim Noon, another one of our colleagues from a few years back. And then, the process of this particular project has just continued all the way down to the present. We've been able to take students, visit various sites, and then again, the excitement of finding things and then going through the process of interpreting them has been something that I think the students have always enjoyed. And then we also try as much as we can, to bring in new technologies. Here is actually one of Mike's graduate students, Jim Torpy. A few years ago, we were doing, using a drone to take aerial photographs because they give us a much better perspective on various locations, including this particular modern village. Back to Greece. The site of Agios Vasilios is one that, again, Tim Gregory decided that we should study. It's a very important site in this particular region of Greece. It dates to the early part of the 13th century AD. It was occupied primarily during the period when Westerners had essentially taken over parts of the Byzantine Empire. And we went in to record as much as we could of this particular location. And one of the things that I like to tell students is that I will never ask you to do anything that I have not done myself many times. And that includes climbing walls, getting on top, and then having somebody who's on the ground, taking the measurements. So it's learning by doing, but also saying, that you have to set the example. If you're going to ask people to do things, you better be willing to do it yourself. And from that work, one of the graduate students at Ohio State was able to develop a reconstruction of this particular medieval site. And now again, back to Ohio. One of the things that I was able to do here at Wooster was to contact a local group. Actually, they got in touch with me first. It's a group of concerned citizens who were interested in preserving local historical cemeteries. They contacted me to help them out with, myself, with some students. And here what they're doing is they're probing to see if they can identify and find some of the collapsed tombstones in this particular site. They were lucky enough to do that. They found this one, for example, on the left, but they also were able to identify the owners of this, or the people who had been buried at this particular site. And it included two men who had served in the Revolutionary War. And the locals then contacted the Department of Veterans Affairs in Washington. And the department has this protocol that if you're able to find individuals, like this, they would provide the tombstone. So that this reconstructed cemetery then received sort of a rededication. So we were very much involved in helping this particular organization reestablish this cemetery. And it was also an ideal setting, for us to kind of train students again. Several of them recording the gravestones there on the left, and then on the right, this is me, showing some of our students, including Andrew Womack, who I think is one of the people who submitted some work to you when he was just an undergraduate. We were doing sort of the mapping of this particular cemetery. And then another one of my former students, David Massey on the left, who's currently finishing up his dissertation in geography. We were trying to identify sort of the edges of another one of the cemeteries, and one of the local companies then carved this particular stone to set in place, for the people to know these particular locations. We were contacted also by another group about 10 years ago to go and investigate, see if we could again identify the limits of this particular cemetery. The students are probing in, trying to find any of the tombstones that may have collapsed. Using a metal detector, we're able to find agricultural tools and a variety of other kinds of things. You just, in many ways, in archaeology, you just don't know what you're going to find in many instances. And then more recently, about 5 or 6 years ago, we were working on another site. In the upper left, that's me with a good colleague of mine, Nigel Brush, who works at another university. He's an archaeologist and geologist. He knows the archaeology of this surrounding area extremely well. He did his dissertation out of UCLA on a survey where he identified some 500 archaeological sites. And he's been excavating a number of them over the years. Whenever he does go out on an excavation from Ashland University, he takes his students, but he also invites me to bring my students as well. So as collaborators, we're able to, to bring students from a variety of different institutions together. In this particular case, a farmer had found evidence of a mastodon, which dated back about 11,000 years. And we went out during the fall of 2014 and conducted an excavation that lasted from the summer up through November. And these were some of the easier, more identifiable elements of the mastodon that we found, these mastodon teeth. What we were able to do then is to exhibit some of that material during our annual Archaeology Day. This is one of sort of our outreach programs that we've established at the college. It's in conjunction with International Archaeology Day, which occurs every October. And there's Jim Torpy with some of the mastodon teeth, and he would explain, to various people who came around. One of our other students in the lower right-hand side, we would always have some exhibit of human evolution, so the skulls. And this is something that especially the younger children who would come to the college would find very interesting, to look at these particular items. One of the things that I also tell students is that if you're going to be an archaeologist, you have to kind of learn what I call the art of group living. You have to get along with lots of different types of people and lots of different kinds of settings. It's also very much true, that archaeology is a collaborative endeavor. There's not an archaeologist really that does an excavation or a survey by him or herself. You have to pull in lots of other people, and that includes your various students. Here's a picture actually of Whitney in the upper left looking at a rock shelter when she was an undergraduate. Over on the right is one of my students from Kenya back in the mid-90s. She was interested in animal bones. We found a dead cow. I said, you have lots of bones now to clean, right? And then washing the pottery, which is one of the constant things. You always have to clean up the artifacts. And then in the lower right is another former student of mine from Kenya, Joe Rife, conducting his own excavation in Greece just a few years ago. One of the things we try to do is to get students excited, when they're really young, so they're always fascinated by neat stuff like tombs. And then as they get older, they become a little bit more attuned to the particularities, of the archaeological endeavor, including ethnoarchaeology, and then the whole idea of doing presentation as well. There's Jim with my son at the SAA meetings in 2017 doing a presentation about the drone work they had done in Cyprus. Now, archaeology isn't just all work, right? You also have to kind of, what I call, have team building exercises when you're on campus. And for me, I include having intramural football and softball teams, and then getting the seniors really excited about kind of, smacking each other around a little bit. But it's also important to kind of develop the networks through time. And this is a group of many former students through the 2000s, from about 2003 all the way up to 2018, who all gathered at the Society for American Archaeology meeting in Washington a few years ago. And at those meetings, again, what the students learn from doing their research is that they have to communicate that to other people. So here are some of our students on the left and the upper right at the meeting in Washington, telling various people about their independent study research, their senior thesis research, and then on the lower right, a student from 2010 at the meeting in St. Louis doing the same thing. So this becomes, I think, an integral part of how you're able to communicate what a discipline is about. And I just want to talk finally about some of my colleagues. Greg Wiles from the Department of Earth Sciences is a stalwart in the field. He's the one that first took me down to Pee Wee Hollow, where he was collecting some samples of clay, for his research. But he also indicated to me the location of prehistoric mounds in this particular location. And the two young boys there are standing on top of that mound. That became an element of study, including some work that had been done actually by the guy in the blue shirt there back in the 1950s. And we were able to collect that information, Greg and I, and then a student also were able to kind of put together an article out of that. And then the important thing also is to kind of show the breadth of your work. There's Greg in the bottom left, where he usually works is in Alaska, collecting tree cores, so he could date the movement of glaciers over time. And then he's also been doing a lot of work with historical buildings, throughout our region, coring various beams so that we can get proper dates on a lot of these buildings from the early settlement period in the 19th century. My colleague, Olivia Novara is the other archaeologist in the department. She is a Mesoamericanist, so what that has allowed us to do is to kind of broaden our reach a little bit, by having people who work in different areas, talk to the students. Olivia has been able to take students down to her project in Guatemala, which has allowed them to have another sort of broader range of experiences. My colleague Derek Counts in the middle there, that I've worked with in Cyprus for a number of years. And the student on the right was in Cyprus with us and was able to, to attend, one of the lectures, that Derek was able to provide for us. This is my colleague, Tom Hall, who's in attendance today. Tom is the guy basically who introduced me to world systems analysis. We've, been able to collaborate on several different articles for a period of time when he was still teaching at DePaul University in Indiana, and then commuting over to New York, to Cornell, where his wife was working. He would stop over, for a night at my house here in Wooster. We would talk about different things and then decided, that we needed to publish some things together. And here we are, on a trip that we took together to England to give a talk about world systems analysis and migration. And it's also some of the people that you don't necessarily have classes with, but who are important in the field that you come to admire through their work. This is Patty Jo Watson, one of the premier archaeologists of the past century, a person of intense intellectual capabilities, but also just one of the nicest people that you'd ever want to meet. And she is one of those kinds of gracious people that will talk to anyone at any time about any kind of subject. And finally, we shouldn't forget, the people that provide a home away from home for us, when we go abroad. For example, this is the Marinos family. Tim knows them extremely well. Lita does also. I was able, very fortunately, to spend about 10 years every summer at their hotel in Greece. And then I also have to pay homage to my cousin and her two children who hosted me in Athens for about 20 years in a row. I would stop there, visit with them for a little while. And then on the way home, I would leave a big bag of dirty clothes, which I could then pick up again, when I went back. She was also very gracious in hosting a number of my students that I would bring at various times, and she would make a homemade meal for them. And that's the end of the discourse that I have. So thank you very much for your attention, and I'll be happy to answer any questions that people might have a little bit later.
Well, thank you so very much, Nick. I think what we were all hearing and what I know to be true about you is just the tremendous passion that you feel for your work. And again, as Hook says, it's almost impossible for educators to kind of even speak to students about self-actualization, etc., and passion for their work if we are not embodying it ourselves, if we are not living that life ourselves. So thank you so much for sharing that. I also particularly appreciated how you've integrated your discipline-specific perspectives with these broader sort of insights and reflections on pedagogy, where I think we could all sort of take things from that. And I think one of the things that I found myself sort of nodding to when you were saying that, and I saw a lot of people in the audience doing that too, was when you were saying that I'll never ask you to do something that I haven't done myself. And and that's just something that I can relate to very much, at different points of time, where it's because you do have educators who will do that sometimes. It's like, we'll work, put in 12 hours, work in this. Meanwhile, I won't do that myself. And so, you can't really expect students to put in the work, to push their boundaries, to embrace uncertainties, all of those things, without sort of embodying that yourself. And I'm so glad that you express that in such simple and yet such powerful and effective, lines. And I think finally what I really wanted to say, and this is also something that I wanted to emphasize, though I think we've heard it, loudly enough in what you've said, but just this idea of challenges. I mean, one of the reasons, that I emphasized your own journey, and being the son of immigrants and, first gen education and so forth, is precisely to highlight the kind of challenges that we do talk about, even politically. The structural challenges are real, they're not just in our head, they're real. And yet to stop the conversation there, that there are extenuating circumstances, and so you cannot do anything and I cannot do anything, and that's it can sometimes feel very frustrating and disempowering. And so your willingness to share some of these practical ways, like when you talk about, well, how do we build collaborations? How do we build networks? I know, as someone who's come from a modest middle-class background myself, that's the biggest thing you don't have. It's not just economic capital, it's also cultural capital, connections, networks, learning how to do things that you get as a matter of just moving in certain households and that you don't hear in other places. And these are very practical skills that we have to kind of, both model ourselves and then teach our students. And so I really particularly appreciated, you highlighting those too, that there are solutions. It doesn't make structural challenges go away, but that there are real skills, that we can learn and we can talk about, and that can certainly make things a little bit easier, right? Than not. So thank you again very much for that. I don't think Dr. Toumazou has been able to join us. So we're going to go on to Dr. Greg Wiles, who's again been very kind enough to join us. He's joining in from Ohio. We have people from so many states across the United States right now and across the world. And thank you very much for joining us from Ohio. At least you're in the same time zone.
Right.
So, and I also wanted to really thank you for your large-heartedness and, when we were organizing, sort of making your skills and time available to make this possible. Thank you very much for that. So I'll invite you to, share your thoughts.
Thank you. Yeah. And and that was inspiring, Nick. And I really like the way too, it's a continuum, right? The archaeological record continues and we're all part of it in that sense, which is fascinating to think about. What I wanted to share, and I'm honored really to be a representative of the College of Wooster in talking about Nick's career, is thinking about, well, a lot of the topics, of course, that he covered already. The whole idea of student faculty research and the synergy between the research and teaching. It has been quoted many times to say, well, that's what you bring to the classroom, is that enthusiasm and the newness of those, the discovery is something that's not just for our students shown here, but across the generations, and that's something that's very special about archaeology and has been now with Olivia as well, who unfortunately couldn't be here today, but as in the synergy between the research and teaching. So I wanted to kind of hit on some of those things. I also wanted to say, Nick made an incredible call on when to retire in terms of I wonder if he looks into the archaeological record and sees the pandemics and understanding of the past and the world systems in how it all works. He picked the optimal time to do do that. And we know that he's still working away. I still have students in my class who are archaeologists who are finishing up their independent studies. Many of you know about independent study at Wooster. And so it's kind of an ideal, combination of Nick's pedagogy and our independent study. And I hear about the late Woodland and the Hopewell daily in my hydrology class. So it's exciting and interesting and fun to think about. Nick talked about his work with Ashland University and Nigel Brush, and they also set up this consortium over the years, also with Jared Burke, who we'll talk about a little later, the Ashland, Wooster, Columbus Archaeological and Geological Consortium. Here's some pictures of the students on weekends working but not just students, but really almost 3 generations, at least 3 generations in a lot of ways, of volunteers, of backhoe operators that live down the street from this operation, as well as medical professionals in Columbus who get away for that weekend to decompress and such. And here's the Wooster students, of course, interacting with that group. So it's that whole community that Nick talks about that made, I think it's up to 100 people that are on the email list, that come out and are fascinated. Many archaeologists that are new to archaeology in retirement. So it's also a special part, I think, of that community. And many of you, of course, are parts of those communities. The Archaeology Days, the lecture series, standing room only, often bringing archaeologists from all over the country and the world to Wooster, interacting. The students also have agency in terms of the logistics of those, introducing the speakers, and here's the Archaeology Days, flint nappers and atlatls and other things hands-on, again, the hands-on learning. Importantly too, Nick didn't play it up, but bringing in students is a big deal these days. It always has been, and getting the younger generations interested, but also turning heads for the various archaeologists that come to Wooster not decided yet. In these interactions in the community, it was big time in that sense as well. I think the community also, speaking with students and community members, also talking about, as he talked about, athletics and the intramurals teams for staff and faculty that were playing. He modeled the idea of having fun and getting out and doing things. He's a noon ball enthusiast, which is basketball at the gym here. I've talked to the noon ball people recently, and they were talking about, of course, it's on hold right now, but I'm sure Nick will be back when they get the go ahead, go back into the gym. That he's a tenacious defender. In that tenacity, you can see in his vita, right? So he's gone through, he's funded all these projects methodically over the decades, and so that same kind of skill set is brought to academics as on the court. I will say one pro tip. I've heard that if you're guarding him, his left-handed dribbling needs a little bit of work, but I think maybe now, and when we get the go ahead, he'll be able to get back and take care of some of that system. He already talked about the innovation, right? The drone flight. It was the archaeologists that did the first drone flight on the campus, and these archaeologists wrote the manual for our total station in earth sciences. So that activity. I will also say, in the spirit of the way things are today, that there was the first one to do GIS online at the college. And this was maybe 15 years ago. My numbers might be more or less right. Some of you, I think, were in on that at other small colleges that got a grant to do bring GIS to the College of Wooster, and of course, with the expertise not being here, so going out remotely. And that's something, of course, we're doing on a daily basis right now. So kind of the innovation in the head of their time, in that sense. Students and agency, I think that too, that students were very much involved with the Archaeology Days and the speakers coming in and giving them that hands-on, logistics of being an academic, as well as logistics of getting off into the consulting industries as well. And here they are, legions of them going off to these national meetings each year to present their research, in making contacts and such. And I know many have gone University of Michigan in that sense as well. I think another thing that the students brought up was the you know, especially the Greek dinners at Nick's house over the years, that not only they were kind of built from various shops and various cheese shops, that had Greek affiliation across Northeast Ohio, and even a sustainably locally sourced grape leaves, wild grape leaves from the area park that Nick would pick and then put into these dishes. And so that with the students and the faculty and the staff and community members and Greek holidays that he celebrated really brought home, you know, that whole continuum that he outlined, which was really interesting to think about. And finally, I think thinking about, and this is the same picture, and he mentioned that Dave Taggart here in the lower right-hand corner with Dorosos, his son, who's also an archaeologist, now senior at Ohio State University, that the legacy is you know, continues. That's infectious in a good way, right? That enthusiasm and the understanding and the excitement, right? That archaeologists often come in with it, and we're often jealous of that feeling that archaeologists are almost, you know, the cast is die for many of the people in terms of becoming archaeologists. So here we are, and he mentioned that, but this was a site that was so excavated before radiocarbon. And then Nick, through his contacts at the Wayne County Historical Society, was able to get the artifacts, was able to work with students and train the students on how to analyze those artifacts. That, coupled with the radiocarbon dating and the previous maps, was basically you know, turned into a publication with students' names on them, as well as that's 3 generations of people that were on that author line. And it's pretty remarkable when you think about that, you know, bringing the next group along, but also paying homage to the older folks now passed away, but that had originally done those excavations. So that's the idea that, and that's how I want to end up, that idea of being the closer, you know, bringing all that kind of disparate information to many of us, but bringing it together and making it into a published, you know, article that we can now cite when we go there on geological expeditions and that kind of thing. And so it's really pretty impressive in that sense. I will end with one, just Jared Burke, who is also, I have a bunch of quotes. I was going to do a word cloud, but I didn't think Nick was into word clouds. But one of the names that would be big would be friend, that I saw a lot, like 30 years of friendship. And that's another thing I think is important. This last picture, I like that. The picture of Nick there is just pixelated enough to kind of reminiscent of a Greek statue, I think, in the chiseled features in that sense. But Jared said that when he was working with students and working with Wooster students over the years, and Kenyan students, I think, as well, that it was a real pleasure to work with this group that was always enthusiastic, even-tempered, and nice to be around. And then he said, a lot like Nick. And I think that really embodied, it really touched me, and I think in a lot of ways. So thank you, Nick, congratulations, and we look forward to your next contributions. Thank you.
I had to unmute myself. Thank you very much for sharing that. I know that as a very talented and popular teacher yourself, you know, you kind of embody a lot of these qualities too that you're talking about. So I had a question for you, especially because you talked about the idea of fun. And I was wondering what you feel the role of, you know, joy and whimsy is, you know, in the classroom as a part of our strategies and, you know, of teaching. What is the role of that, even and especially as we are dealing with very serious issues? Is there a way for us to still sort of, you know, bring in some of the joy and the whimsy and to have that be an active part of our pedagogy in some way?
Yeah, well, I think the former students of Nick's that I contacted, they really appreciated that, kind of to give, you know, good permission to have fun. When I think about what Nick's pedagogy, you know, whether it's on the sports field or whether it's watching the Pittsburgh Steelers, you know, or surveying the campus, you know, all these kinds of things that might not seem like fun to many people, but you know, it definitely kind of lightens the mood and gets people out and interacting with one another, maybe in a different setting, which I think you know, feeds back on itself nicely. Like Nick said, you have to live together, maybe in close quarters as archaeologists and such.
Thank you. I'd like to call upon Dr. Whitney Goodwin to share her perspectives now. I think Dr. Toumazou's just joined us too. So right after Dr. Goodwin, we'll go on to Dr. Toumazou. Whitney.
Yes, thank you, Debotri. I'm happy to be here. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay, great. So I am here to add a bit of perspective on what it was like to be Nick's student. I was at the College of Wooster as an undergraduate from 2004 to 2008, where Nick served as my advisor. So that was admittedly quite a while ago now, but his teaching made such an impact that it really carried me throughout my graduate school years and shaped me into who I am as a scientist and educator today. So thankfully, I've had the great privilege of Nick's continued guidance as a mentor and friend, and although it still feels strange to say, as a colleague now. So I arrived at Wooster from a small town in Ohio as a first-generation student. I was essentially clueless on how to behave. At school, I didn't know how to address or email a professor or what office hours were for. I remember some particularly cringeworthy emails in my first year that I hope Nick doesn't remember. But he never let those things affect how he treated me. All of his students were worthy of the opportunity to learn and grow, and there was never judgment or favoritism. We were all given the same level of dedication from him. I'll add too that I wasn't an easy student in other ways. My personal life in undergrad was rough at times, and Nick treated these situations with grace and understanding as they came up. I think it can sometimes be easy to forget that students have full lives outside of the classroom, and he was truly remarkable in acknowledging that. And this might not be something we normally think of when we talk about teaching, but it's one of those things that can really make or break a student's college experience and shape their feelings about their education, as it did for me, thankfully in a positive way, thanks to Nick. But to get back to his teaching, I remember several ways he fostered our learning in the classroom. So going hand in hand with his dedication to us was the level of commitment that he expected. So the expectations for his classes were very high, but the rewards were really, truly even higher. He didn't want us to recite the material back to him. He wanted to hear our unique perspectives and for us to bring in our life experiences and how they related to the topics that we were discussing. So he really showed that he valued our unique views, and it made the learning experience that much richer for all of us who were there. So in that sense, and in many other ways, we were treated as professionals in training and not just students. So another big part of that was not always walking us through things, but rather helping us to create a community of practice among our peers where we felt comfortable turning to each other for help. So he would give us free reign of the classroom and the lab, and we'd use it. You know, we'd stay late at night and make sure we had all wrapped up our class projects and readings together. And in fact, we became so close and so invested in the program that we came together to build up the Archaeology Club and managed to meet the requirements to get our own house on campus by the time I was a senior. So this gave us the chance to room with some of our closest friends, of course, but it also allowed us a space to host events and bring students together and to really build those connections. And of course, Nick was instrumental in all of this, from the administrative side to actually attending our events. So to me, this was all tangible proof of the effect that he had on our student community. And that community persists today. Some of my closest friends and colleagues are students that I took classes with under Nick at Wooster. I see some of them here today, so that's fun. But I think the area where his engaged approach was most evident was during our undergraduate thesis project, the independent study that Dr. Wiles mentioned. So this is a year-long one-on-one course we have during our senior year, and it results in this thesis. So to truly understand what Nick did for me there, though, we have to go back to my first year in the program, where completely clueless me, who had never been out of the country, I'd never set foot on an airplane even, I sat in Nick's office and I told him that I wanted to be a Mesoamerican archaeologist. And he made it happen. it truly baffles me to this day to think about, but he really did. So his initial response to that was essentially, okay, we need to get you to Central America if that's what you want to do. So he used his academic contacts to find a field school that was RAU sponsored, which meaning all expenses were covered, which made this experience, this unattainable experience, accessible to someone like me. And to say it changed my life would be an understatement. So I spent originally 6 months in Honduras learning the ins and outs of archaeology and undertaking my own research in the field. And when I returned to Wooster, I actually had primary data that I could use for my thesis, but still a lot of work to do, of course. So those of you who are familiar with Nick's work know that Mesoamerica isn't exactly his area of specialty. You can't really get much farther from Cyprus on the globe. But this is what he does for his students. He commits to learning alongside you. So to keep me on track with my thesis, he set weekly appointments. We would both read a set of articles independently and then come back together to discuss the articles and how they related to my thesis. So that kind of teaching really set me up to excel in grad school, and it shaped me into the scientist and scholar that I am today. Not to mention that I continue to undertake research in Honduras, where I got my start, thanks to Nick. But specifically, that unique combination of the collaborative mindset and independent thinking that Nick's approach fostered set me up to direct my own research projects early on in graduate school, and really to create my own path through my education. So I never relied too heavily on advisors for project ideas or opportunities, but rather took my ideas to them and asked for advice and support when and how I needed it. I have to admit that not every advisor met this approach with the same enthusiasm that Nick did. But knowing what a good advisor could do and be really pushed me to advocate for myself throughout my education. And then in recent years, I've had the opportunity now to mentor students of my own, and Nick's model is absolutely the one that I strive to follow. I do my best to consider the whole student, their needs and their goals, and then I do what I can to teach them how to learn and push myself to learn what I need to be supportive of them in the same ways that Nick was of me. So lately, I just want to share, I've even found myself doing this with my daughter, who's now almost 3. So if she shows an interest in something, last week it was the solar system, and this week it's been rabbits. So I'll go to the library and get every book that I can find, and we sit down and we learn together. And for me, that's the perfect example of how deeply Nick's teaching influence has been in my life. And I'm so grateful to have had it and to have had a few minutes to speak to how it's shaped me as the scholar and the person that I am today. And I know I can never truly repay him, but I'll do my best to always honor him in my teaching. So thank you, Nick.
Thank you so much, Whitney, for sharing that very heartfelt testimony. And, and there was so much to learn even when you were speaking, particularly of the importance of grace and empathy and compassion. I was going to ask you also very specifically about addressing different students' needs, particularly women, in the field and so forth. But I think you've already really spoken to a lot of that. I also want to share this that as the organizer of this event, who is of passionate archaeologists and anthropologists, being neither myself. I know several of my students who are majoring in that field are attending today, but I am not. And so for me, one of the fun moments was really looking at signature lines of people I was talking to. Dr. Lauren Lees, for instance, her signature line reads, once there was a little girl who was fond of dolls, and then the dolls is crossed out, and instead it said skulls. So, and you're thinking of how it challenges, gender schemas and so forth. And so that was something that, as a gender studies scholar, I was kind of looking at. And so, that was something that was very cool to share. So I think in the interest of time, I'd like to invite Dr. Michael Toumazou to share briefly a few thoughts. And then, Dr. Toumazou, thank you so much for being here. I think you got the time a little bit wrong. You logged in at 1 a.m. your time. you will need to unmute yourself.
Yes, I do. Now you can hear me. Sorry. Thanks for organizing this. Thanks for the confusion, and apologies for having to run off to class. But I didn't want to miss this by, you know, a long shot, because I have known Nick for a long time, and it's the least I can do in 5 minutes, talk a little bit about our experiences together in Cyprus. So I will just confine myself to a few statements and run off to do Herodotus. Nick and I met at the Neme Archaeological Project, Neme Valley Archaeological Project in Greece back in 1984 and 85, where we slept 2 beds apart. The person in between us, by the way, is the head of the Epigraphic Museum in Athens. In case you visit there, you can say, I know your friends. So we have seriously said, when we start our own projects, once we get our PhDs, we're going to invite the other person to join. And that's exactly what I did in 1991, following a very preliminary mini season of excavation in Cyprus. And Nick joined me in 1991, started the survey with Rick Kardulias of Ohio State. And he never bargained that he would still be there, but there he is 30 years later, and he must like it a little bit. So what can I say about Nick? I don't know where to begin and where to end, and I don't want to bore you, and I don't have much time, but you all heard already some. I couldn't say better than Whitney that I just witnessed about being a student of Nick, and how wonderful and consummate teacher Nick is. I can't, in all honesty, think of anybody who comes close to Nick in combining scholarship with teaching. He's just exquisite. I mean, the care he takes for his students is just enormous. And I've witnessed that for 30 years now. I couldn't be wrong. So Nick joined the project in 91 with the intention of being there 3 to 5 years maximum, maybe. And started the field school with Rick Yerkes, which was more systematic at the first years, but he's continued as associate director to join the project for a few weeks or a month or more in the summers, whether we have a field season or a study season. And he's involved in all levels of the project, and the project would not be possible without Nick. I can't imagine having this project for 30 years now, it's going to 31, without Nick by my side. I mean, in every way possible, administratively, teaching-wise, field-wise. He gives his share of lectures, an event in the villages when Nick has his church napping with the students, when we supply ourselves with lots of Band-Aids, and we get some blood coming out, but it's always a fun thing. Nick, as was already said, will drive the students to he's a tough leader. And I remember, especially the first few years, walking through these fields under not very good weather, sometimes very hot, rarely very wet. One summer he got caught out in the thunderstorm with the students scattering around all over the fields. And he'll drive those students through the fields, through thick and thin, and everything in between, including manure, that some fields were fertilized. The experience with Nick has been incredibly productive, and like I said, I got more than I bargained for with Nick, and I look forward to his continuation of affiliation with the project in future years, despite the retirement or what do we call it? Completing the academic aspect of university teaching, but Nick will always be a teacher. And I look forward to him coming to Cyprus, perhaps spending less time in the field, more time attending weddings, and maybe hanging around the cafes, talking to some of the old men who we always talk archaeology anyway. So with this, I'm going to close my brief statements, and thank you, Nick, Thank you for all you have done for the project, and congratulations. And like I said, I look forward to many years of being your friend and your collaborator. And thank you all for attending. It's just wonderful. So.
Thank you so much, Mike. Thank you very much. I know you have to rush off to teach, but
Yeah,
I'm
yes.
really grateful that you, you spared a few more minutes to speak with us. I wanted to emphasize that, again, there's a very, very diverse group of people who are celebrating Nick today. Not everyone is here, but it's just astounding, the diversity of that group and how it cuts across gender and race and class and nationality lines. And again, in the interest of time, I'm not going to read out a lot of what I've received, but I do want to briefly include just a few sentences from Dr. Lauren Lees's and Dr. Andrew Womack's statements. They were your students, and again, while they couldn't be here themselves, I just really, really wanted to read out just a couple of lines. So Lauren wrote, she said, "Congratulations, Nick. You deserve all of the honors and accolades that you're receiving today and throughout your career. You've influenced so many students. Your announcement in Professor Smale's class about excavating in Cyprus and in Greece had a profound impact on the course of my life, but also later in my role as a professor. As you know, the belief in and encouragement of undergraduate students to attend field schools and perform research can be unusual, but you encourage students to do so to their benefit. I'm so proud of continuing this tradition at Youngstown State. Because of your influence, we have now sent students around the world for bioarchaeology, primatology, I'm going to have to pronounce all of these, forensic anthropology. You have had a lasting impact at Wooster, but also back home here at Youngstown State." So that's Dr. Lauren Lees writing for you. And last but not the least, Andrew writing for you. Again, I will just read just a few sentences. He says, "Nick, as a fairly clueless high school student, I had little idea of what archaeology was actually all about outside of Indiana Jones movies and pop science articles. However, as someone who loved both history and the outdoors, it seemed like a promising combination of my interests. But it was after enrolling in your Introduction to Archaeology course at during my first semester at Wooster that I was hooked." And then he writes to all of us saying, "Nick is a highly gifted educator who, despite being the sole archaeology professor for many years at Wooster, managed to consistently bring in students to the major and provide a robust set of courses, introducing them to everything from advanced archaeological methods to ancient Greek societies to modern political anthropology. In my very first year, he managed to dispel my many misconceptions of the subject while still inspiring a passion for the past that put me on a career path in archaeology that has continued to this day. Aside from his engaging presence in the classroom and innovative class activities, Nick was always encouraging us to work harder, to pursue our interest in archaeology beyond the classroom. This included making sure students could meet leading archaeologists that he brought to campus through the colloquium, getting us engaged in fieldwork locally, as well as his long-running collaborative field school in Cyprus. And every year, without fail, bringing seniors to the National Archaeology Conference to present their work. And this constant encouragement and passion from Nick continued well after I graduated, as he wrote letters for grad school, met up with me at conferences. Knowing Nick was likely in the audience of all my conference talks was amazingly encouraging and kept me just enough on edge to know that my research had to be high quality. I know I'm not alone in the mentorship I received, and so many other graduates have gone on to have successful careers because of Nick's excellent work and his pedagogy. So that's Andrew speaking for you. So again, in the interest of time, I know Dr. Galaty and I were talking, and we were talking about how long his closing comments should be. And I said 10 minutes. Well, we'd really just have 10 minutes for the event. So you'll know when to stop. So yeah, so I don't know if we will have time for questions at the end, maybe just a few minutes right afterwards. But I will once again thank everybody for being here today. It was very, very, very wonderful for me to be able to put this together with someone that I respect as much. And And I'm going to give it to Mike for his closing comments. And again, once again, thank you so much, Mike, for providing the unit support that you did towards organizing this. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Deb. I will actually try and do this very quickly because I think it would be great to have some questions from especially the students in the audience. You know, thank you for organizing this, Deb. It's been really tremendous. And I thought I knew Nick pretty well, but I've learned new things today. First of all, I learned, Nick, that you're a Steelers fan, which is really unfortunate, but I'm a Packer fan, which is another good working class football team, but I'll let that go. Like I said, I'm going to try and do this really quickly. I first met Nick in, I think it must have been 1994, and it was at a Society of American Archaeology meeting, and I was a new graduate student. I think it was Minneapolis. I met Nick with a group of folks, you know, and of course, we were at parties and stuff like that. And the first thing that struck me about Nick was he was an archaeologist who didn't drink, which makes him really unique. But the other thing that was really amazing about Nick is he always had a group of undergraduate students with him. And I was a pretty new graduate student, and so I was still kind of learning the ropes. And I remember thinking like, wow, you know, why is this guy here with all these undergraduate students? You know, are they like groupies or something? You know, what's going on? But I really quickly figured out, and we all kind of figured this out, that these students who were with Nick, as so many of them have said, were colleagues. They were there with Nick, not just to learn archaeology, but as his collaborators, as his active collaborators. And this was a really important first lesson for me to learn as a graduate student, how important his students were to him and his work. I actually finished up graduate school and ended up going to a small liberal arts college. So those who don't know me very well, I spent 13 years at Millsaps College in Jackson, Mississippi. And it was the mentorship I received from Nick as a friend and as a colleague, as a fellow archaeologist and a fellow Greek, that really made all the difference to me. You know, I think it's just a fact that a lot of our graduate students, especially in archaeology, they are probably going to get jobs at small liberal arts colleges or community colleges, you know, which was certainly my experience. And what I was teaching at Millsaps a 3-3 teaching load, but I was really committed to my research, and I really wanted to do archaeology and stay active in the field. And what I realized watching Nick and talking to Nick is, especially in that kind of situation, there's no such thing as engaged pedagogy. There's just pedagogy. There was just teaching. We didn't even talk about engagement or think about engagement. We just did it. And for me, that was a survival tactic. You know, teaching 3-3, trying to get grants, trying to live up to this you know, this example that Nick was setting. The only way to do that was to be a true teacher scholar. And I think what we've all heard here today and seen so beautifully demonstrated for us in Nick's opening talk about his career was what a teacher scholar looks like. And I literally couldn't have been as successful as I was without learning how to do that from Nick. So Nick, thank you from the bottom of my heart for showing that to me and so many others how to do that, because I don't think I would have gotten tenure without that lesson. But as we've heard from so many people today, engaged pedagogy is good for the professor, but it's great for the student. And the success you've had, Nick, with your students sending them into the field of archaeology, sending them on to graduate school, sending them out as whole people, as whole individuals, as great thinkers and intellectuals out into the community. You know, it's amazing to me. But I think especially about how we all as academics and as students talk, and Deb, you've been great about pointing us to this throughout this whole panel discussion. We think and talk so much right now about diversifying the academy and how we do this, and you know, and how we get BIPOC students to come into the academy and be successful, not just get here, but be successful and to thrive, how we get women, and how we build this diverse community that we talk so often about. And you know, I think the recording of this panel discussion should be required viewing for all of our colleagues here at Michigan, but in the academy generally, because Nick's career shows us how to do that, which is, I think, the take-home message here, which is engaged pedagogy is the key to how we create the kind of academy, the kind of society we want. And Nick has lived that and embodied that. So, you know, I took like 5 pages of notes here, but I'm going to stop because I do want to hear from the students and hear their questions. But Nick, thank you for everything you've done. I still can't wrap my brain around the idea that you're actually retiring, because you kind of seem like Benjamin Button to me a little bit, but you know, so again, congratulations and thank you all for being here. And hopefully we have a couple minutes for questions. So
Yes.
Thanks, Deb.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Mike, and for those very, very powerful lines. I mean, we could not have had a better conclusion to this panel and the kind of questions we are discussing. Just very quickly on a lighter note, though, you did point out that he doesn't drink, which makes him rare as an archaeologist. You do know what he does drink, though, right? For those who don't know, Nick drinks Coke, and you can offer him Coke any time of morning, night, or day, and he never says no. And I know, as someone who doesn't drink much herself, and I drink Coke too, and I drink milk, and having been judged quite unfairly in academia, I will say that I found a lot of acceptance, you know, with Nick, where we drank Coke together. So on that note, we will end this part of it. And yes, we do have, you know, I do have another class to get to, but we should have time for, you know, at least a couple of questions. So let me open that up just in case folks had any questions to ask. I see Sophia raising her hand. Yes, Sophia.
Yeah, thank you so much for this, Professor Dhar, for organizing it and all the speakers. It was so amazing. I do feel the need to preface my question by announcing that I am a Patriots fan, not Steelers or Packers, Massachusetts born and raised. But to get to my actual question or my actual thought, I really appreciated the piece of your presentation where you talked about how important it was to engage the community, both in terms of communicating what you were doing and being transparent, and even having community engagement in the work itself. When I took my first anthropology class, one of the things that I noticed in an intro class was sort of the traditional hierarchy or dynamic of, you know, expert and subject. And that really rubbed me the wrong way. And I think that that is true of a lot of these fields historically, these social science fields. And so I was wondering, in your time in the field and in the academy, have you seen any like trends or changes in terms of that hierarchy or dynamic, or places where people are sort of challenging or breaking down that traditional historical expert subject dynamic from more of a reciprocal partnership, I guess, between the people and places being studied and the academics?
Well, I can say that I had a great mentor again, you know, especially in John White initially, you know, when I was an undergraduate, because he began the process. The first excavation that he did in the Youngstown area was a bicentennial project, and it was excavating an early blast furnace so that the people in the local community could come to understand the local history, you know, about the steel industry, which was dying at the time, but what that provided for them. And then he continued that, you know, whenever he would have a project, he would invite other people to join. So when I first started doing my own small projects, you know, either at Kenyon or at Wooster, it was always connecting with outsiders, if you will, outside the academic community, and then inviting people to come to our lectures. They would then come to talk to us and say, oh, I'm interested in what you're doing. I'd say, please, come to all the lectures that you want. We have Archaeology Day. If you're interested in coming into the field, I'll put you on our list whenever we go out. And my colleague, Nigel Brush, has done the same thing. The community that Greg talked about, there are retired teachers, there are engineers, there are a number of different people who just have this fascination with archaeology, and they kind of thirst for doing something like that. And we give them the opportunity as much as we can. This is becoming more and more, I think, part of the norm in archaeology and anthropology. Archaeology specifically, one of the things that people are saying is, well, we often get public money to do our work, through various grants and so on. So therefore, we should report back to the public. And what's happened is that various groups, for example, here in Ohio, the Ohio Archaeological Council has sort of a speakers bureau, so that you get contacted by a particular organization, they'll send someone who might be interested in talking to them. So I've never turned down an opportunity to talk to a local group, whether it's a bunch of 4th or 5th graders who are a great audience, I have to say, because they love seeing stuff and touching things, and they have 1,000 questions and observations to make. And it's important to get them that early, because that enthusiasm sometimes goes away, by the time they get into high school and college. But if you can nab that early, that becomes sort of a lifelong passion. And I think more and more archaeologists, especially that I know, are doing that sort of thing, trying to connect with the communities around them as much as possible.
Thank you so much for that excellent question, Sophia, and for your answer, Nick. We have time to take just one more question. Would anybody like to pose another question? Okay, since I don't see any other hands, I will end with a final question. What are your plans from now on, Nick?
Okay. Retirement, for me doesn't, it means, sort of ending the formal part of classroom teaching and so on, but it doesn't mean the end of, being an archaeologist. As Mike and any other archaeologist can tell you, every year that you dig in the field, you've got 4 or 5 or 6 years of lab work, and then analysis, and then publication, which can take many years. So I've got many years of research to do. I'm still working in the archaeology lab here every year, or every day rather, examining materials sometimes that are 20 or 30 years, in the past in terms of excavation, because things sit around for a long time before we can get to them. I still plan to be, going to Greece and Cyprus, when the pandemic is over, and continuing field research, going to conferences on a regular basis. I see no end to that. So I've got my future pretty well planned out, I think. And in going to the conferences, I get to see people like Whitney and Andrew and a variety of others, who will, they're the new generation now, of archaeologists. And if I could add just one thing, in terms of continuity, I found it really interesting. And like I said, the first field school I had was with Gary Fry in 1974. When Gary retired from Youngstown State, the person who replaced him was Lauren Lease, who had been a student of mine at Kenyon. So there is kind of an unusual level of continuity there as well. Right?
Thank you very, very much. And also for emphasizing, what you've always stood for: lifelong learning, lifelong passion. And just like so many of the others were saying, you will not only always remain an archaeologist, but always also remain a teacher. And we will all, continue to benefit from that, I'm sure, in so many ways. So thank you once again to everybody for joining in today and for making this such an uplifting experience. I know many, many of us have been very emotional in celebrating you, and that's for good reason. And so once again, we want to congratulate you for this next milestone in your journey. We thank you again for joining us. And I want to thank once again everybody who joined in, especially those from other time zones and other countries. Thank you very, very much. Please have a very good rest of the week. Thank you. Bye.
Thank you, Debotri. Thanks, Mike. Thanks to everyone who participated.
Bye, everybody. Thank you.
Take care, Mike. Thanks, Mike.
Yasu.
Yeah.
Thank you.